So the point of this is basically make life easier coming to the track. There's a lot of things you can do ahead of time on the car. There's a lot of things you can do to help yourself out, make life easier here, make your life easier on the track driving. I see a lot of people fighting their cars and don't know what they're fighting basically. And so many times to see people show up and thrashing on their car to get it ready. It's like when you come to the track, you should be ready to go. Get some real practice time in instead of spending half your time building the car or sitting in the pits. So, anyhow, we'll go over basics of initially prepping the car, simple stuff, just simple things, camber alignment things, just to make sure the car is going to go straight and do what it's supposed to do, what you expect it to do. Some simple tips that things we see people do that you don't realize you're doing wrong that really do hurt the car. And then we'll go from there. We'll go a little more in depth, and then we can go through and basically you drive your car, see what it's doing, and give you some tips to make it easier to drive. Because basically right now, your first goal is not going fast. Your first goal is getting around the track without crashing. Speed comes basically you basically want to get around the track without wrecking. That will get you a higher result than going really fast and wrecking every other lap. Because that crash is 3 to 5 seconds, and if you just went a second slower than everybody else but didn't crash, you'd still go faster than the guy that crashes every other lap. So that's the biggest thing, is make the car easy to drive, reliable, so it finishes races and you're staying between the boards and you're comfortable driving the car, basically. Not driving over your head. A lot of times slowing the car down will make you faster because, again, less wrecks, faster time, regardless. Jason made a 5-hour course here out of this, but I'll let him start off a little bit, and I'll throw in as we see. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of little things, that simple stuff you can do that make your life so much easier. So,
yeah, Tony's right. You don't want to have to fight cars as you're going around the track, right? We see a lot of that, and I'll tell you, I was telling Tony and Daniel before that when I got back into it, I used to race with these guys back in the late '90s, early 2000s, and when I got back into it, I felt like, oh my God, what am I doing? I didn't remember anything, right? And I had to relearn everything I was doing. So I can only imagine people that have zero experience how some people are feeling, right? Totally lost, I imagine. So that's what this is for, is to try to help get rid of that totally lost feeling, right? And not have you have to worry about fighting the car going around the track. So I think we'll cover some basic things. We'll cover, like Tony said, I put together a syllabus. We'll cover some things like car prep from the mechanical side, right? Building the car up, just some basic tips. Some things on electronics for car prep basics, again, some maintenance type stuff, recommendations. So when you come off the track every round, check some things over, make sure that nothing's broken, kind of stuff. And then we'll maybe talk a little bit about some of the tuning, very light, basic tuning stuff, right? We don't need to complicate things at this point with getting into any kind of in-depth discussion on tuning, right? That can come later. Don't worry about that.
Yes, if you want to come over and have fun tuning sessions, listen to us on a Friday night.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we're constantly bantering back and forth on the next thing.
So we've done this way too long. So.
Yeah. We're giant nerds too.
So yeah, it's. You start talking roll centers, you start talking scrub, you start talking bump steer, stuff like that.
Allowing scrub radius to stabilize the car
as
you go into a corner.
All these things have an effect on the car, but they're all getting into the physics of the car and stuff like that. And it's a lot of it is trial and error, which is one thing I don't see a lot of guys doing, is try stuff, change things. How did it feel? Was it different? Was it better? Was it worse? If it was worse, change it back. Try something different. Best example of that, unfortunately, he's out in California right now, is a buddy of ours that raced with us back then. He was a kid. Jesse Roberts,
We
who
were all
ended
kids.
up going on to be national champions multiple places and times, went to the Worlds. When Jesse first showed up, he was a kid in the way, and truly he was. Overdriving the car, bouncing off the boards, and by the time he moved out to California, he was actually working for Team Losi and ended up moving over and working for HPI. And his methodology was different than anybody else's, but it worked for him. He worked hard. When he decided he wanted to be good at this, he would come to the track and he kept a notebook and he would change something. And did it work? No. Change something else. Did it work? And he learned how to set a car up by trial and error. But he was very dedicated to trial and error. We look at it different. We look at the theory and the physics of what's going on and stuff like that. He learned simply by, I tried this, it didn't work. I tried this, it worked. Let's move on to try something different. And between us and him, we could go walk to a track and look at it and look at the track and say, all right, do this, this, and this, set the car up, and it'll work. And 9 times out of 10, it worked.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of that. And this is just all anecdotal stuff, right?
Yeah.
Don't worry about all this.
Yeah.
It's not. But there was a race up in Long Island, New York, back in 2002 that I went to, and the track it's off-road dirt track up there, and consistently the track is like a volcanic ash or low traction. Oh yeah, you've been up there. Yeah. Right. Very low traction, right? So went up there and was a little bit lost. So I called these guys up and we start pinging setups
Ideas
back and forth, ideas
yeah.
back and forth, right? And we found this is at midnight, right? The night before the race is going to start, right? And we finally said, okay, all right, we think this will work. So I set my car up at the time. This was 2-wheel drive modified, and I went up and TQ and won the event. Yeah, but that's the kind of thing we do.
Right.
Is we worked out setups. Now that's not what this is, right?
Right.
Again,
This
is basics.
That's RC 202.
Yeah. So we're definitely 101. So speaking of 101,
Mm-hmm.
right? Car prep basics. So when you're, I guess just some very basic things. When you're building the car, here's some tips, right? Suspension, free movement, right? Should fall under its own weight.
Everything
Like
should
that.
flop.
Yep, everything should flop. Steering, I've got the servo connected here, so it's not going to do it, but it should be free movement throughout the entire range of movement, right? And it should flop down on its own. You don't want excessive
Right.
play.
We see so many people getting caught up and it's sloppy and it's loose and slop is not necessarily a
Not
bad
necessarily
thing.
a bad thing. So
it's better than the car being bound up. Because the car being bound up, now besides what you're doing to your shocks, the suspension is adding friction and adding dampening to the system too, and you can't control that.
Yeah.
So
So for instance, if you got an arm, you push it up and it stays up there, right? That's going to work against the shocks, right? And it's going to do weird things out on the track when you might notice that something, you go into a corner and it hook steers, right? Or you might notice that, hey, this car is not consistent at all.
or
That's a
comes off a jump
Primary,
sideways every
yeah.
time, you know.
That's a primary reason for doing that, right? Is if you've got something bound up, you don't have the suspension
Moving free.
moving freely and at the same rates, right?
Right.
So free suspension throughout the entire range of travel, free steering throughout the entire range of travel when you disconnect the servo.
I'll always check for binding, bumps, clicks, everything.
Yep. Right. Yep. And like Tony said, don't worry so much about slop. Slop's not. Everybody know what I mean by slop,
Yeah.
right? It's that.
Ev-
Don't worry so much
Yeah.
about that. It happens. Now, if you've got something that's moving a 1/4 inch, yeah, you probably got something broken to replace that. But just a little bit of slop, don't worry about it. Shock absorbers. These shocks are a pain. I'm not going to mince words on these shocks are a pain, right? They're mini shocks.
They are a pain to build when they're right,
Yeah.
but getting them there is a challenge.
So pass that around, just kind of compress it a little bit. What you want is free, smooth movement, right, without major air pockets in it. And we can show you guys how to build some shocks
Right.
here. We've got some extra ones, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But free, smooth movement, right, without excessive air in there. Because air, if you got a lot of air in there, that just reduces the damping capacity of the shock.
Where's the Probo parts?
Hold on.
I pulled my butter.
There should be 0 rebound, correct?
So that's a little bit of an advanced tuning discussion. But what he means by that is if you take the spring, if you pop the spring off, I actually had mine built with a little bit of rebound. What he means by that is when you push it all the way in, that's rebound, right? Pops out a little bit. There's varying ideas on what's the right way. I usually build mine with just a little bit of rebound. I don't know if Tony does it. Do you, Daniel?
What was that?
Build the shocks with a little bit of rebound.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Some people don't. That's a little bit more of an advanced tuning discussion. So you can change how the car is handling based on how much rebound you've got in the shock. Don't worry about that. Okay. The main point is when we build these, we want them to be smooth and not have excessive air in them.
I build them so I make sure left and right rebound about the same.
Right, that's a
make
great
sure
point.
they don't. One doesn't go this far, one goes this far, and
Yeah, great point, Daniel. You want, especially side to side, right? You want them to be the same. So whether they rebound a lot, rebound a little, none at all.
Just make sure they act the same.
Right, whatever the case is, you want to be definitely the same side to side, right? You don't have anything funky going on where you're going over a jump and it does this on it, right? Daniel, you had a case of that in your JRX 2 a few weeks ago where the shocks, one had a bunch of air in it for whatever reason. I think it was
I think one leaked.
and every jump, man, it do this, right? Like, Daniel, your car is doing something weird there. Well, we found out why. So the shocks weren't the same.
What determines how much rebound the shock has?
Just,
Good.
I don't have one up.
It's basically how much oil you build in it. It's how much oil versus how much air, right?
Right.
If you have too much oil in there, you're gonna
It'll
hydrolock
hydrolock.
it, right? So you're gonna end up only there, and you're not gonna be able to push it in, right? So that's hydrolocking. You don't want that.
These are what's considered an emulsion shock. Basically, there has to be air in there at all times because as the shock shaft moves into the body, it's displacing oil. So if it's full of oil, oil's not compressible. You can't. It won't go anywhere. So you basically end up with a fixed shock. It will not move. So you have to have air in the system to compress the air to allow the shock to compress, basically. That versus there's what's called a bladder shock, basically like traction shocks. They've got the rubber bladder in the top of them. The bladder, basically, those should not have any air in them whatsoever. The bladder separates the air pocket from the oil so they don't intermingle. Emulsion shocks are weird, and honestly, 20 years ago when we started doing this, the original Associated RC10 shocks were emulsion shocks, and we hated them because they went squishy, squishy, squishy. And it's like, back in the day, there was a Kyosho shock
You'll
called
hear
the
that a lot
Option House.
back in the
Yeah,
day.
back in the day, there was a Kyosho sold a shock from their Option House line, which was a bladder shock. And you look at the track, and I would say 60 to 70% of the cars had those shocks in their car because they had the bladder in them. Well, we learned later that the problem with the bladder is it adds rebound to the shock.
It's like a gas charge shock.
Yeah,
right on.
and rebound in the shock makes the car bounce on the landing. So, I know we weren't. Basically, when I try to build a shock, I try to build a shock with negative pressure. Basically, it actually will suck the shaft in, not push the shaft out. The idea being,
I think I had mine set up
Right.
a little bit, right? See how if you pull it all the way out,
it'll suck back in.
just barely.
Basically, the idea with that, you're not adding any spring rate to the shock. Your spring is the only thing that's holding the car off the ground. And if you build them where they're pressurized and they push back out, that's just adding rebound to the shock, and it actually makes it rebound faster than it compresses.
Again,
So more technical
worry
stuff,
about this.
but
right?
it is. If you ask, we'll answer. So
Yeah,
it's not a
sure.
big deal.
Yeah.
So.
But the focus again is equal side to side, right? And you don't want big pockets of air in there. Where, like, I guess the best example I can give is when you compress your suspension. If you hear it go squish, right? Like you got an air pocket in there. That's
It's
'cause
kind of
got an
working
air
your
pocket
shots.
in there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you want to try to avoid that. And you want to be about equal side
Right.
to side, right?
Like I said, later we'll go through actually how to build them. And
Yeah.
Get them right.
Because it is painful.
And then we'll show you some cheats we did. So.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so we talked about suspension and steering, free, smooth movement, right? Transmission, drivetrain, right? What you want to see is with the motor disconnected. I don't have.
There's one disconnected
here.
right
Yeah. But you're looking for smoothness, no notchiness, right? As you roll it over. That's the entire transmission, drivetrain, bearings, all
Right.
that. So if you've got something binding up, right, that's going to manifest itself later on with weird behavior on the track.
Right.
As far as the differential on these all, I don't know that every single 18 scale has a gear diff.
They're
but
pretty
most
much
of
all
them
gear
do.
diffs,
Yeah.
unless you put the MIP in it. So
Oh, yeah.
So
But again, smooth movement on the diff, right? Pass that around, just
and
feel the diff.
there's a lot of talk about putting gooey stuff in the diff to slow the diff
Yeah.
down and things like that.
Works for a little while.
Not a big fan of it because it becomes a maintenance thing. Because it's not going to stay there. It's going to get slung out, and then it gets slung out onto the other gears in the transmission, which is just bogging the rest of the transmission down. So,
You guys have seen that all right on the buggies and the trucks and stuff. You get the grease out
the goo grinding out the side of the transmission case. And most people, we've pretty much told them step one is open the training case and get the gob of grease out of it, because they are way over greased from the factory.
Yeah, specific to the Losi Mini Bs and Mini Ts. That is a tip is to open that transmission up.
What
And,
truck are you looking for?
clean all that grease out, all that black grease. I don't think the other makes
For
necessarily have that, but on
which truck?
Losi cars they do. Clean all that black grease out, right off the gears and everything, and then put the differential back
Savage
together.
21, I do
Just
not,
a
unfortunately. I
little
don't have
small
hardly anything
line
left for
around
it all. Yeah.
the differential gears.
Sorry,
right?
no problem.
The spider gears there,
Right.
just enough to get some lubrication there, but clean the rest of it out. You don't need it. It's not necessary.
Right.
It just binds everything.
Yeah, we pretty much try to make it a rule to let everybody know when they start racing this. Step one is to pull the transmission
Yeah.
apart and clean the goop out of it. So it will give you 2 or 3 mile an hour on the straightaway just by doing that. The other things, if you start getting to hop ups and stuff like that, the only thing that's really necessary, in my opinion, if you're running modified, if you're running brushless, basically, is either the MIP or the Losi slipper plates. Other than that, nothing else is necessary in that transmission. It works pretty darn well.
Everybody know
MIP,
what we're talking about slipper.
yeah, MIP top shaft is not it's neat, but it's not necessary. We're talking going from a steel to aluminum top shaft that the mass of it is so small and so negligible, it's not going to give you a huge improvement in anything. And
So
the biggest thing
we're
is
talking about
it's more for a
It's a slipper.
reliability factor, especially you put power in the car. The factory plastic slipper plates will not hold up.
yeah, absolutely.
They will shred. For stock, they're perfectly fine, and I still run stock plates in my Mini T, in my stock truck, and in my stock buggy. You don't slip the slipper in the stock car. My slipper is only there to absorb impact off a landing, and that's it. So it's not spinning, slipping, generating heat, melting stuff. So, and that is one thing to kind of pay attention to is the slipper. It's not there as a traction control device normally. Of course, in modding these things, you almost have to have it.
I was gonna say we disagree on this.
We disagree. In 10 scale, I will always tell somebody the slipper is not a traction control device. It's there to protect your transmission. That's its only purpose. And these, it's a little bit harder. Everything happens a lot faster. Everything happens a lot more aggressively. So the slipper will save your finger from overzealousness, basically. So
So I guess the takeaway here, right, is just when you build the car up, be mindful of the slipper. It should be set so that you initially get on the throttle, you come down off the jump, you're not just deadheading.
never lock the
your
slipper clutch.
transmission, right?
Yeah. This comes true with anything. Never lock the slipper clutch. Even on the flip side of things, the drag guys swore, oh, you got to run a locked slipper on these drag cars and everything like that. The guys that are fast still run slipper clutches. The problem you find is that little tiny bump in the track, you need that little bit of give, because you hit that bump with a locked up drivetrain, and the wheel starts to spin. When it comes back to nature and wants to go, it's spinning, and it won't grab traction again. With that slipper clutch there to absorb that little grunt, it smooths things out and hooks the car back up. So